Welcome to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really diving deep into a story that many people have heard of, but maybe don't know all the twists and turns. It's about faith, power, and ultimately, tragedy.
We're talking about the Branch Davidians.
Exactly. It's a complex narrative, and we're going to try and, peel back the layers. It starts quite a bit earlier than many might think.
It really does. The name itself, Branch Davidians, actually has this specific biblical meaning. It points to an anointed branch figure from the Old Testament.
Okay, so that's already setting a certain expectation, isn't it? Let's go back. Where does this story actually begin?
Well, the roots are actually within the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yeah.
Way back in 1929.
Okay.
There was a man, Victor Houteff, he was a member, and he came to believe he had this new message, a special insight for the church.
A new message. How did he deliver that?
Through writings. A series of tracts he called the Shepherd's Rod. He outlined his interpretations there.
And how did the main Seventh-day Adventist Church react to this shepherd's rod? I'm guessing not too well?
No, not well at all.
Oh.
His ideas were firmly rejected by the church leadership.
So, rejection. What happens then? Does he just stop?
Not quite. This rejection led him, and those who believed his message, to separate. They formed their own distinct group in the 1930s.
Ah, okay. And this group became...
They called themselves the Davidians, and they set up a community near Waco, Texas. They named it the Mount Carmel Center.
Mount Carmel. That name certainly carries weight. And Davidians. That connects back to King David.
Precisely. It reflected their core belief, their hope in restoring the Davidic kingdom of Israel. The name was deeply symbolic for them.
Okay, so Houteff leads this group. How long does that last?
Well, Houteff himself passed away in 1955, and leadership then transferred to his wife, Florence.
His wife took over. Interesting. Did she continue his specific teachings?
This is where things take a significant turn. Florence developed her own interpretations. She actually predicted a major apocalyptic event.
Oh, based on his writings.
No, that's the key thing. It wasn't directly from her husband's original shepherd's rod. It was her own reading of prophecy. She predicted this apocalypse for 1959.
Wow, okay. A specific date. That's always risky. So 1959 comes and goes.
And, well, the world didn't end. As you can imagine, this caused a huge amount of disillusionment among the followers.
I bet. A failed prophecy like that must have really shaken people's faith.
Absolutely. It led to the fragmentation of the group. The original Davidian Association, as it was formerly known, essentially dissolved by 1962.
So the end of that chapter, but the story obviously doesn't end there. How do we get to the Branch Davidians?
Right. So around the time of Houteff's death, actually in 1955, one of his followers, a man named Benjamin Roden, stepped forward.
Okay.
Roden claimed he'd receive his own new message from God. A continuation, perhaps, but distinct.
Another new message, and he forms a new group.
Yes. He called his group the Branch Davidians. And that name, Branch, was also deliberate. It references a specific prophecy in the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament.
Zechariah's branch, often seen as a messianic figure, right?
Exactly. So Roden is positioning himself and his group within that prophetic lineage. And after Florence's failed prophecy and the resulting chaos, he managed to gain control of the Mount Carmel property.
So he takes over the physical center near Waco.
He does. And he led the Branch Davidians until his death in 1978.
And then another transition.
Then his wife, Lois Roden, became the leader. She took over after Benjamin passed.
Okay, Lois Roden is in charge. Was it smooth sailing from there?
Not entirely. Leadership transitions in groups like this can often be contentious. And after Lois eventually passed away, a power struggle really started to brew.
Involving
her son, George Roden. He was definitely part of that struggle for control.
So internal conflict was already present before the name most people associate with the group even arrives on the scene.
That's right. It's into this already complex, somewhat volatile mix that Vernon Howell arrives in 1981.
Vernon Howell, the man who had become David Koresh, what was his initial role?
He came to Mount Carmel, seemingly, to study. He studied biblical prophecy under Lois Roden.
Just a student initially?
Initially, yes. But he was charismatic. He started attracting his own following within the community quite quickly.
Okay. Gaining influence.
So much so that by 1983, he'd actually formed his own separate faction, really. He called it the Davidian Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association.
That's a mouthful, but it shows a split, right? His group versus Lois's official group.
Exactly. For a while, you had these two distinct groups operating, both connected to the Branch Davidian lineage, but separate.
And when Lois Roden died, that must have intensified things.
Immensely. Koresh, or Howell as he still mostly was then, saw his chance. He claimed leadership. In 1987, he actually filed legal documents asserting himself as the president.
And George Roden didn't just accept that, I assume.
Definitely not. This led to a very direct and, frankly, violent confrontation.
This is the shootout.
Yes. In 1987, Howell and a group of his armed followers went to Mount Carmel and ended up in a gunfight with George Roden and his supporters.
A shootout over control of a religious compound. That's extreme.
It was. And Howell's group ultimately won control of the Mount Carmel property through that confrontation.
Wow. And how did the followers who were loyal to Lois, or maybe even George, see this?
Well, it's quite telling. Those who remained loyal to the Roden line, particularly Lois's legacy, viewed what Howell did as basically identity theft.
Identity theft, strong words. They felt he'd stolen the movement's name and legitimacy.
That seems to be the feeling, yes. And it's around this time, after consolidating power, that Vernon Howell makes a very significant change.
The name change.
He changes his name to David Koresh.
Why those specific names, David and Koresh?
It's deeply calculated. David obviously connects him to King David, the great king of Israel. And Koresh is the Hebrew name for Cyrus the Great.
Cyrus, the Persian king who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, also a major figure.
A very significant figure, seen almost as a Messiah-like figure in some Jewish traditions for that act. So Koresh was deliberately linking himself to both kingly and messianic lineages.
What was the goal there? Just status.
It seems his aim was grander. He spoke about creating a new lineage of world leaders, starting with him. It wasn't just adopting a name, it was claiming a destiny.
Positioning himself as central to prophecy.
Absolutely. And he started reinterpreting biblical prophecy in ways that centered him. Most significantly, perhaps, he identified himself with the Lamb mentioned in the book of Revelation chapter 5.
The Lamb who opens the seals. Isn't that usually understood to be Jesus?
Traditionally, yes. But Koresh taught that he was this Lamb, or at least a figure represented by the Lamb, who had to appear before the final second coming of Christ.
So he's inserting himself into the end times narrative in a absolutely pivotal role, a necessary precursor.
Precisely. He wasn't claiming to be Jesus returning, but someone essential for paving the way.
That's a huge theological shift for his followers to accept.
And it cemented his authority. By 1993, as things were really heating up externally, he was even encouraging his followers to move away from the Branch Davidian name.
Really? What did he want them to be called?
He suggested they call themselves students of the seven seals, tying directly into his revelation interpretation, or even Koreshians.
Koreshians, fully centered on him.
It shows a clear move to rebrand the group around his specific identity and teachings right before the siege began.
Which brings us, unfortunately, to February 1993. The Waco siege. It starts with the ATF, right?
Okay.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
That's correct. On February 28, 1993, the ATF attempted to execute a search warrant at the Mount Carmel Center.
And the warrant was for, what were the official allegations?
There were very serious allegations, primarily concerning illegal weapons violations, stockpiling firearms, potentially modifying them illegally, but also reports of sexual abuse within the compound involving minors.
Okay, serious charges. But the execution of the warrant, it didn't go smoothly.
Not at all. It went disastrously wrong, almost immediately. A fierce shootout erupted.
How bad was it?
It was deadly. 4 ATF agents were killed in the initial gunfight, and several Branch Davidians also died. It was chaotic and violent.
Just a devastating start. And after that initial failed raid,
The FBI quickly took command of the situation, and what followed was a standoff. A long one.
51 days. That's almost 2 months. What was happening during that time? Negotiations.
There were negotiations, yes. Tense, often difficult negotiations. The FBI surrounded the compound. It was a siege situation.
Were any people released during that time?
Yes, some. 19 children were eventually allowed to leave the compound during the 51 days.
19 children. But many more remained inside, including Koresh and most of his followers.
That's right. The core group remained, the standoff continued, and the tension just kept building. It was a pressure cooker.
This whole period, it's just fraught with tension. And if you're finding this deep dive compelling and want to make sure you don't miss our explorations of other complex stories, maybe take a moment now to hit that subscribe button. We try to unpack these events carefully.
Good point, because what happens next is the part everyone remembers, the tragic end. April 19th, 1993.
The final assault.
The FBI decided to end the standoff. They initiated a final siege operation using armored vehicles, like tanks, to breach the building. And they began inserting tear gas.
Tear gas to force people out.
That was the stated intention, yes. to make conditions inside unbearable and compel surrender.
But that's not what happened.
No. Tragically, fires broke out within the Mount Carmel building. Multiple fires, spreading rapidly.
And the result?
The result was horrific. 76 Branch Davidians died in the fire and the collapse of the structure. That included David Koresh himself and many women and children.
76 people. And the cause of that fire, that's still debated, isn't it?
It remains one of the most contentious points of the entire event. Hugely debated.
What are the main viewpoints?
Well, the official government investigation concluded that the fires were deliberately set by Branch Davidians inside, possibly as part of a mass suicide pact, or maybe accidentally ignited by overturned lanterns during the chaos.
Okay, that's the official finding.
But many survivors and critics of the government's actions maintain that the fires were either accidentally started by the FBI's assault, perhaps by the tear gas projectiles or the tanks damaging the building, or even, some allege, deliberately started by the government forces, though there's less evidence for that specific claim. The accidental ignition by the assault itself is a more common counterargument.
So, no universally accepted answer, just profound tragedy and lingering questions.
Exactly. It's a heartbreaking element of the story. And you mentioned a unique detail earlier. There's that story about the flag, right?
Oh, yes. During the siege, tell us about that.
Apparently, during the initial ATF raid and throughout the siege, there was this unusual flag hanging in one of the compound windows. It was made of satin, apparently, and had a pink, six-pointed star.
A pink star of David on satin. That's very specific.
Very. And the story goes that this particular flag design, or at least the colors, wasn't standard. Benjamin Roden had supposedly been given it years before, but refused to fly it because he felt the colors were wrong, not biblically appropriate or something.
But Koresh flew it.
Koresh decided to display that specific flag, and it hung there, getting tattered during the siege. It's a small detail, but kind of speaks to Koresh making his own choices, maybe even deliberately breaking with some of the Roden traditions. A symbol of his unique leadership, perhaps, hanging there amidst the destruction.
A strange, potent image. So, after the fire, after the deaths, what happened to the survivors?
Several of the surviving Branch Davidians were put on trial. A number were convicted on various charges, mostly related to the initial shootout with the ATF agents, like firearms charges or conspiracy.
Were there lawsuits against the government?
Yes. Civil suits were filed by survivors and families, alleging wrongful death and excessive force by the federal agents. However, these lawsuits were largely dismissed by the courts. They were mostly unsuccessful.
So legally, the government's actions were largely upheld. What about the movement itself? Did the Branch Davidians just cease to exist?
It's not quite that simple. The group fractured, obviously, but didn't entirely disappear. Today, there are actually different groups that trace their lineage back to the original Davidians or Branch Davidians.
Different groups with different views on correct?
Very different views. There's one group that still uses the name Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventist. They follow a line of leadership through figures like Doug Mitchell and now Trent Wild that completely rejects Koresh. They see themselves as continuing the true movement that existed before Koresh deviated.
So a continuation of the pre-Koresh group.
Exactly. Then there's another group called the Branch, the Lord our Righteousness. They generally acknowledge Koresh's role historically, but they're often critical of his specific actions and interpretations, seeing him as flawed.
Acknowledging but critical. Any others?
And then, sadly, there is still some individuals scattered around who continue to believe that David Koresh was indeed a true prophet. Some apparently await his resurrection, along with the others who died in the fire.
Still awaiting his return. Wow. It shows how deep those beliefs ran and how fragmented the legacy is.
Absolutely. A very fractured and painful legacy.
This whole story, it's just such a complex tapestry, isn't it? Religious fervor, charismatic, maybe even manipulative leadership, and then this catastrophic collision with government authorities.
It raises such profound questions about faith, about power, about how we interpret sacred texts, and the lines between belief and delusion or control.
When you look back at this whole deep dive, what stands out most to you? What part makes you want to dig even deeper?
For me, it's always the human element within the group, trying to understand the motivations of the ordinary followers, what drew them to Houteff, then Roden, then Koresh, what kept them there, even as things became more extreme. It's easy to dismiss, but trying to grasp their perspective is crucial, I think.
That's a really important point. Avoiding easy judgments, for me, it really highlights the immense danger of unchecked charismatic authority, especially when combined with isolation and very specific, maybe unorthodox interpretations of prophecy, how quickly a group can become separated from the outside world.
Yeah. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. How much does the way the outside world, including law enforcement and the media, perceive and interact with a group like this influence the outcome? Could things have unfolded differently with a different approach, or were certain dynamics inevitably leading towards conflict?
That's a heavy question to end on, and probably one without easy answers. Thank you for joining us on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast for this really intense exploration.
We hope it's given you not just facts, but also some things to think about.
Indeed. Until our next story unfolds, thanks for listening.